Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to a special edition of City Lights Live, our virtual reading series. We are beaming to you, as always, from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to offer an acknowledgement and pay respect. Today's event is especially meaningful to us here at City Lights because at the heart of it is a celebration of bookselling. For those of you with a love of rifling through the stacks of a well-stocked bookstore, who understand the value and importance of browsing, and who are voracious readers of Bookforum and NYRB, or who have stacks and stacks of books piled up all around your home, well, you have come to the right place. We are celebrating the launch of the new book titled In Praise of Good Bookstores. It is published by Princeton University Press and authored by the bookseller extraordinaire, Jeff Deutsch. Jeff is the director of Chicago's legendary Seminary Co-op Bookstores, which in 2019 he helped incorporate as the first not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling. So In Praise of Good Bookstores is a love letter to the art of bookselling. It explores all the qualities that make a good bookstore. Jeff dives with unbridled and infectious enthusiasm into an exploration of why bookstores matter and envisions a future where bookselling is not only survived, but is thriving. He draws upon his lifelong experience as a bookseller to articulate the qualities that make bookstores an important part of our lives. So today's program will be divided into 3 parts. Each session using Jeff's book as a kind of a template, and we'll take a deep dive into the art of bookselling. Our first session is titled The Presence of Books. Jeff Deutsch will be in conversation with Alberto Manuel. Together, they will reflect upon a life lived well with books. Alberto Manuel is an award-winning anthologist, translator, essayist, novelist, editor, and former director of the National Library of Argentina. He is the author of numerous nonfiction books. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of In Praise of Good Bookstores. We may have actually a little guest visitor in a moment, a little surprise. But before that, I really want to send out my thanks and appreciation, and really, it's such a great pleasure to be able to welcome Jeff Deutsch and Alberto Manguel. Jeff, congratulations on a fabulous book. As a lifelong bookseller, I can't tell you how much joy it really brought to me. You've managed to just articulate, what so many of us in the trade have been trying to for so many years, and we really thank you for that service. So welcome to the virtual City Lights.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for having me. And I don't know, there is a special guest here. So Paul Yamazaki is on the screen as well. I actually, before Alberto, we turn it over to you, and I want to say a brief word about you as well. I do want to just read this is the shortest excerpt any author will ever read in a reading, but it's from page 171, and it is from the acknowledgements, and it is 2 sentences. And it's dedicating the book to Alberto Manuel and Paul Yamazaki, who have led the way, and I hope to honor their influence. And it is just such an absolute privilege to me to be in conversation with you, Alberto, and for City Lights, and to be hosting this, and Paul, for you to be here, who've really shown the way of how to be a bookseller, a generous bookseller, a thoughtful bookseller in the world, 50+ years at City Lights. And then Alberto, who also started as a bookseller, and I hope we can talk a little bit about your teenage years. I know we're talking about my book as well, but it's about bookstores, and you got your start in bookstores as well, and have through the first time I read your books was in the 90s. A book called The History of Reading completely changed my trajectory, and it was right after I started in bookselling, and I have been following you for decades, and this is just an absolute honor. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Jeff, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to City Lights that have lit my library since, oh my goodness, 1970, was it? I can't remember that far. But I'd like to start with a question for you, Jeff. I loved In Praise of Good Bookstores. I thought it was delightful, intelligent, witty, and above all, heartwarming to see that bookstores are still praised in this way. But I have a question. Why good bookstores?
Mhm. Right. It's a really good question. I think that the main point of the book for me is to celebrate bookstores, and really not even just bookstores, but book spaces. And I love being in any book space. I can go to a thrift shop and have one bookcase of books, and I will look through every one of them and be happy. I'll go to a library, a teeny tiny library, and be happy. I think there are many great bookstores that have small or large collections, have sidelines or cafes or not. And really the idea of the good bookstore was a way to, like the good society, like the good life, it was the way to think about this platonic ideal almost of a bookstore, which is a space devoted solely to books. And the notion that we don't need anything diluted in those spaces to create this expansive environment that allows one to get lost among the stacks, to scan the spines, the physiognomy of the walls, right, and to find meaning, purpose, delight, challenging ideas, things of that sort in those spaces. And I will say that City Lights is one of my personal favorite examples of a good bookstore. I mean, it's an exceptional bookstore and it's a great bookstore, but it's also a good bookstore in that it has books, only books. And I personally will go up to the poetry section on the second floor, and I have gone and A to Z through that section many times, and every time I'm discovering new things, and the brilliance of buyers like Paul to create that sort of experience is the very thing that I'm celebrating in the booksellers who create these spaces.
And the co-op bookstore, if it's a good bookstore, it doesn't sell mugs and t-shirts and candy?
This is a great, I'm glad you asked that, because I think there's been there have been some there's been some misunderstanding about how that part of the business plays into my thinking, especially about the bookstore. It certainly can sell all of those things. In fact, there are many great bookstores that have a large percentage of their stock are not books. What I lament, and there is really only one lament, and there's really only one argument, maybe, probably not even, it's probably all just celebration, but if there is one, the lament is that we have inherited a model of retail to finance bookstores that is not predicated upon the very thing that we care about in bookstores, which is an amazing browsing experience. And my concern that I express about candy and sweatshirts and coffee and things like that is that bookstores need the sales of those items in order to support the work that they're doing. They're not making curatorial decisions in order to, because they want a certain sweatshirt or tea or whatever in the store. If they do, that's amazing. But really the system is broken, or the model is broken. And as Peter mentioned at the top, we actually are a not-for-profit bookstore now, and we became the first and only not-for-profit bookstore in the country whose mission is bookselling. And we did that partly because, well, it was honest. We have not made money in 25 years, actually. And we've relied on our community and foundations and other institutions and individuals to financially support us. But even with that, we were thinking, well, we're not even able to pay our staff what not even what we want, but what is a reasonable salary. And this is true for all bookstores, that what booksellers make is, it's obscene, actually. And we should all be ashamed of ourselves, it's not just the bookstore owners, because they can't do much about it, but what we as a community and people who care about bookstores have thought in terms of the value of these spaces and how to support them. We are not creating a viable model for bookstores. And so a big part of what I'm hoping to do with the celebration is shift the conversation about what model should we have for a bookstore. And it should not be a retail endeavor. It's a cultural institution, and we shouldn't need to sell other things in order to make a living. We should be able to sell books and only books, should we choose.
What is your solution?
The solution is, there are multiple solutions actually, and so ours is one of many. But the first solution is to shift the rhetoric away from a bookstore as retail model. It's a cultural institution. So in the 21st century, no reader needs a bookstore to buy a book, and no bookstore can make it on the sales of new books alone. And those two facts are really important to acknowledge as we establish a model for the 21st century. We inherited the retail model. We never actually, booksellers never actually decided, well, let's become retailers. We all just wanted to bring books into a space, welcome the community in. That was the idea. So if readers don't need a bookstore to buy books, why do we even need a bookstore at all? Or do we even need a bookstore at all? And I know you, Alberto, and I've seen you, I've watched you in bookstores. I've seen how you browse, and you are a world-class browser, a world-class reader, and you love bookstores. You love being in bookstores, and I do too. And you've spent time at City Lights, you've spent time at Seminary Co-op, as have I. We know the power of a great browse and what it does for the mind, what it does for a community, what it does for the soul. How do we build a model then that supports the true product that a bookstore provides, which is the browse?
Can you do that without radically changing society?
I don't know. I hope you can, because we've got this one little sliver that we hope we can figure out, and that's it. And I don't know, but we'll see. I certainly think that there are dozens of communities who even have existing bookstores, but also might not have bookstores, but really want them, that don't need to radically change society. They just need to slightly change the understanding that a few people who love these stores and these spaces have about the model. And as soon as we shift away from a bookstore as a retail endeavor, where the cost from the supplier and the difference between the cost from the supplier and the list price of the product is how you make your living, that's what retail is. That's not what we do. And thinking about, like, there's some really interesting examples from 100 years ago, actually, because these lamentations are not new. So Christopher Morley, for example, who was one of our great bookstore enthusiasts, writes about how a bookseller needs to combine the virtues of the barroom and the bodega, right? And so, and the barroom and the bodega, and thinking about having, the cocktail of the moment, but also the scarcest vintages throughout all time on the shelf at the same time. And H.L. Mencken, 100 years ago as well, went in a different direction and compared us to a haberdasher, a clothing, someone who sells clothing. And in addition to the meeting all the hazards of the current fashion, he says, we have to also keep in stock every kind of clothing that was in favor since 1750, I think is what he says. I'm sitting, I happen to be at I'm in Princeton right now, and I'm at the Princeton University Press offices, and happen to be sitting in front of some of my favorite books, and truly happen to, because this is just where I was able to have a seat. And I've got Paul Valéry's works here, and I've got Dante's works here, and Coleridge's works. And go to the Seminary Co-op, go to City Lights, and you'll find those books on the shelf. In fact, you'll find probably 15 or so translations of Dante on the shelf. How many translations does one need for a good browse? Probably a dozen. I don't know. Alberto, what do you think? What do you think? You like wandering through paradise yourself now. How many translations of Dante do we need on a shelf for a good browse?
That question belongs really to real estate, and I want to go to about the identity of the good bookstore that you are describing. You're speaking of the mechanics that a bookstore needs to be set up as part of the community, change the consciousness of the community, for the community to understand that a bookstore is part of the community's identity, and therefore absolutely of the essence. But what makes a good bookstore in terms of the relationship to the community? Why one bookstore is attractive and another is not? What does that attractive bookstore present?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. In recognizing the need for bookstores in general, part of it is also recognizing that there is no one way to run a bookstore, and there's no one reader to which these bookstores are geared. In addition, a bookseller, and I know Paul would agree with this, and we've discussed this, we don't put the books that we read out on the shelf. We don't put the books that we read on the front table. We develop, along with our community, a certain profile, a certain persona, a certain collection.
Exactly. That's where
right?
I wanted to get, that you go to, or at least I go to a bookstore because I go to that bookstore as I go to see a certain person and not a certain other person. I like the conversation with that person and what that person is presenting. So is it the bookseller that gives the bookstore an identity?
I think that the bookseller, as far as I'm concerned, a good bookseller will reflect their community and will listen and watch as the community shifts and changes. And the great bookseller, and Paul, I would count as our one of our great living booksellers, will both create and reflect the community. And I think that helping a community find itself and establish itself, but also ensuring that there is a sense that when one walks in, that their taste, their interests can be seen. I had a really powerful conversation yesterday, actually, with somebody who does the buying for the New York Public Library, Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx, I believe. And we were talking about how neighborhood branches work, which is very similar, of course, to bookstores, right, in some way. And that it's not about being seen on the shelf based on identity or age or things of that sort. And all of those things are important. But it's about being seen in terms of one's interests, and especially the idiosyncratic interests, right? And so recognizing that walking into a store and seeing a book about fabulous beasts because I'm interested in the way in which the literary imagination has worked, and I suddenly come across a book that Yale University Press publishes by one Alberto Manuel about fabulous beasts throughout history, and think, this store cares about me. This store actually understands that this area of inquiry is important to me, and those sorts of discoveries are critically important. But once that book is found, what actually is sitting next to that book? And what are the things I didn't know I wanted or didn't know I needed? And that is, I think, what distinguishes the great bookstore.
The law of the good neighbor.
Yeah. The law of the good neighbor. That's exactly right.
One of the booksellers that I most admire was really one of the first booksellers that I met when I was an adolescent in Buenos Aires. I was looking for a job to get some pocket money to buy books, of course. Mm-hmm. So I phoned around, and I was 14 years old, and I phoned around the English German bookstores because I thought that I could work there. And one bookstore owner, Lili Lebach, said, well, come along and we'll talk. And I think she was very surprised. I was still wearing short pants at the time. But we had a conversation, and she said, we'll start and we'll see how it goes. And for the first year, she had me dust the books because she said, you can't sell the books if you don't know where the books are. Okay. This was in the prehistory where there were no computers. You had to know where the books were. And so she had particular tastes. She was very interested in the German writers who exiled themselves during the Nazi period, and also thinkers like Gurdjieff and Rudolf Steiner. And at once I remember saying to her, but no one in Buenos Aires knows who Gurdjieff or Rudolf Steiner are. And her answer was, that's why we sell them. Absolutely. And I think that identified for me what the good bookseller is: the person who, yes, caters to your taste, but above all, not only presents new things, but changes your taste, educates your taste, tempts you with things that you didn't know you needed or you wanted. So are you that kind of bookseller, Jeff?
We aspire to be that kind of bookseller, and I think that you hit upon something that's critically important, which is there is an invisibility to the kind of work that we do. In fact, putting those books out there and creating that space for so many of us, and this is, I certainly aspire to this. I think Paul, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it too, Paul. But I feel like the idea of putting things out there and then stepping back so that the reader finds the books themselves, they've done it themselves, is a really important part of the work. However, the challenge for the business of bookselling has been that humility is the exact thing that has gotten us into a situation where we're apologizing for the things that we do really well. We have an incredibly wise inefficiency, right? And that's such an important part of what we do. And we haven't been talking about it. We haven't been celebrating it. And so then it seems like we're failing, and we're not failing, we're succeeding. And sometimes those books sell slowly. I don't know how many of the Gertrude books she was able to sell, but I know for us, there are books that we put out there and they take, the books are supposed to sell once. If you're running a profitable bookstore, I had a conversation with Sarah McNally, who runs the wonderful McNally Jackson Bookstores last night. She is one of the few booksellers who can make a living selling bookstores. She and I have argued publicly and privately many times with Paul, actually, the three of us have spent time together. She thinks I'm out of my mind, that I should be able to make a profit because you just turn the books and it works out. And you sell books if you sell four times, your inventory turns over 4 times a year, you're going to make money. Well, we don't subscribe to that. The books sell very slowly. We're very patient with them, and we leave them on the shelf until the book and the reader have a moment of destiny. They come together, and there is that moment of discovery. And Paul, you have your store turns over very quickly, and I know you're watching, so I don't want to. But if there's anything that you would want to add to any of this, I think it would be really nice for the audience to hear from you if you have something to say on this.
Well, I think when we talk about the metrics of the store, and the privilege that I have at City Lights is that, that over the decades, City Lights and its readers have developed this absolute trust. And so we feel that we don't have to cater to any particular reader or groups of readers, and that we feel the trust of those readers, that what we collectively, the staff of City Lights, present to the potential reader is just what Alberto was speaking and what you've been speaking about discovery, about what you don't know where curiosity is going to take you, any one of us. And so our job as booksellers is to really kind of widen and push the horizons of that curiosity.
Alberto, forgive me for just a moment, but as a bookseller, I just must say that if anyone is interested in the topic of curiosity, there's a wonderful book called Curiosity by one Alberto Manuel. You can buy it. It's probably on the shelf at City Lights right now, and certainly at the Seminary Co-op. I apologize. Go ahead, Alberto.
No, I just wanted to say that my fondest memory of City Lights was discovering those writers that I never had heard of. I discovered Annie Dillard. I discovered Murakami, Ryu Murakami, the real Murakami, the one prize bestsellers. I discovered John Fante. I discovered all those people because they were on the shelves of City Lights, and they were not on the shelves of other very good bookstores, because City Lights has its own taste. Three Lives in New York has its own taste. And it doesn't matter if the bookstore is huge or small.
Correct.
You recognize that the bookseller has put on the table their favorite dishes, something that you might like or might not like, but it's theirs and it's guaranteed by the bookseller.
I will say, since you brought up your discoveries at City Lights, one of those A to Z walks through the poetry section. This was in 2001 or 2002. Paul, I was in your store, and I found Fernando Pessoa for the first time, and had copies of the Book of Disquiet, but then also the Alberto Cairo poetry, which is just like it completely changed how I thought about writing poetry, and would never have found him or thought of him if that wasn't sitting on the shelf in your store.
When you come to Lisbon, I'll take you all to the Casa Fernando Pessoa, and you'll see all his incarnations.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
yes, please.
Yeah, Alberto, maybe share with the audience if you know, like where you are now and what you're doing.
I'm in Lisbon because after I had to leave France and my books were packed up and stored in Montreal, the city of Lisbon offered to set the library up and create a center for research into the history of reading. So they gave us an extraordinary palazzo that's being renovated, and the books will be there. And I invite you all, if you come to Lisbon, to visit. We'll have extraordinary events. We're already starting having events. Margaret Atwood is coming, Maza Mengiste, Olga Tucharkuk, and well, a series of other unknowns.
Well, I want to plug another one of your books, and this is a very natural shift. I wasn't planning this, but I do want to say, so you wrote a book called Packing My Library, where you describe, when you had to pack the library in France. And it's a book that Yale University Press put out 5 or so years ago. And I have to say, without that book, I wouldn't have written in praise of good bookstores. And what I loved about that book specifically, and what was so inspiring to me, is it's a wonderful collection of lyrical reflections with there are these lovely interludes as well that are stylistically very, very interesting and profound and elegant. And at the very end of the book, you share that you're going back to Buenos Aires and that you are, the director of the National Library in Buenos Aires, which is a position that Borges held as well. And I'm reading through it, thinking, this is a big job. There's a lot of work that is to be done there. And meanwhile, we're just spending time with you among books and among your reflections around what it means to be among books. And I thought, that is actually a very effective way to help a reader, without being didactic, understand what it is that we do and why it's so special. And so I began thinking about my own book and trying to conceive of it, and it would not have happened without Packing My Library. So thank you for that extraordinary work, and I'd highly recommend it to our
praise bookstores. And thank you for putting your thoughts into a book, because when we met at the Coho bookstore, it wasn't possible to have a conversation. We had a conversation afterwards, but the one thing that I find in bookstores, it is one of the worst places in the world to have a conversation. I'm constantly distracted by what else. And so whatever you say, I hear only half of that, because, oh, this is a title that's interesting. That's a cover that's interesting. This is an author I don't know. So when I'm back home, I can read what Jeff Deutsch says and pretend that this is a conversation we had in your bookstore.
That's right. That's funny. I was, as I said last night, I was in conversation with Sarah McNally it's her new bookstore, McNally Jackson at Seaport. And I had a very similar problem. I kept scanning the shelves behind her, and I ended up talking. I just started talking about books that were sitting on the shelf because I couldn't focus. I was in a great bookstore.
I'm trying to identify what's behind you. Yeah. I think Coleridge books that you have behind you.
I do have Coleridge books behind me. I have Coleridge, Valerie, and Dante. And one of the things that's interesting about the Coleridge books is one of them is something called the Table Talk of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And Paul is, I apologize, Paul, but Paul is working on a Table Talk volume himself that will be published next year from Paul.
Oh, yes. Well, can I put in an order for it, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's through a publishing arm that we have called Ode Books.
Can I leave it up to you, Jeff, to get it for me? And
oh, absolutely. You will get an early copy, because we'll see if you want to share your enthusiasm with the world. But recognizing, I mean, Coleridge, this Table Talk, and Alberto, you know the genre very well. it's a wonderful genre that we don't think about as much anymore. And for somebody like Paul, I'm sorry to embarrass you, Paul, but we can't help it. 50 plus years doing the work that you're doing have touched so many, not just in the industry, so many readers and so many community members and authors and publishers and obviously booksellers. And to acknowledge it.
Tell us all in the most indiscreet anecdotes, what memories of bookselling are. They should go into the book.
Right. Good. Well, Paul, I think you've got that figured out. That's great.
If
So
I
anyway,
want
yes,
to
go ahead.
mention, because you were talking about having recent books on the shelves, and the bookseller's real job is to keep everything or what the bookseller chooses from the past on the shelf. You don't know when a reader will come and that book is for that reader. I don't know if you remember a wonderful anecdote that Nicholson Barker says. He was looking for a certain book that was published in the 18th century, and he couldn't find it in the New York Public Library, and a number of libraries didn't have it. And he went to the Athenaeum, and they had it. And when he takes it out, he sees that he is the first person who has taken that book out, and he points it out to the librarian. And the librarian says to him without a smile, "But sir, we bought it for you." This was history. That's what a bookseller does.
That's right. That's right. Well, and I will I'll take a moment to speak a little bit to my background and why that anecdote is so important to me. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish world, and there's something that's beautiful about Orthodoxy. There's something that's beautiful about community that's bound to the same book. You know, for instance, there's something called the Daf Yomi, the page of the day, where Jews the world over read the exact same page of Talmud, no matter where you live, and there's this conversation that can happen that is amazing. Now, I rejected all of that, and I am now a deep believer in heterodoxy, and I speak to the bookstore as a haven for the heterodox. And I think that there's something about the singularity of all of our interests and tastes that creates the most beautiful community, and really what binds us ends up being just our love of books and book spaces. And that, to me, that one, well, sir, we bought it for you, that's exactly what we're about.
And this is what we experience every day when you see someone on the subway, on the train, reading the book that you love. You know that this person is a sister or a brother.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Jeff, are you reading in the Jewish tradition? Are you interested in Jewish Orthodox texts? Do you yourself read the Talmud every day?
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, do you read the Jerusalem or the Babylon?
So the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is the Talmud I use, but I don't read it every day. And I love reading it as literature. And actually, there's a wonderful book that I would recommend for anyone who is interested in the Talmud as literature. So the Talmud, for those who don't know, is commentaries on the Old Testament, and it was the rabbis who were basically living around the time of Jesus and Seneca, and were doing, and it's the oral tradition. There are a tremendous amount of legal conversations and it takes up quite a bit of the Talmud.
That's important because they are conversations. It's not a monologue. They're
right.
dialectic.
Right, conversations among great rabbis at the time about how to live, what to do. And so the legal side of it is the majority of it. I have zero interest in the legal side of it, absolutely zero. But then there are two other elements that I find to be incredible. One of them are just the stories, and then the other one are the ethical teachings. And there's something called it's called the Ein Yaakov, but there's an English version that Schocken puts out that was translated by Chaim Nachman Bialik, the poet, called The Book of Legends. And it's an $80 book. Here's a very good example about value and the value of a book. It's an $80 book, which might sound expensive to some, But what you get for that $80 is the entire 63 tractates of the Talmud condensed into one volume where it's only the story, it's all the good stuff, the stories, the ethical teachings. And I actually pull from that book and then some of the other Jewish sources, of course, in my book, to think about time, to think about space and value, these sorts of things. And there's some beautiful things around, like the duration of twilight is one of the bits that I pull out of the Book of Legends. And there's this arguments about how, and this is actually theoretically part of the legalistic side, because when do we say this certain prayer? We say it at twilight. Well, what's the duration of twilight? What a question. And then the answers are so poetic. And the answer that I love the most, there are many answers offered, is that the time that it takes for a drop of blood on the tip of a sword to become 2 drops is the duration of twilight.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful. And are you trying to get people to do the same thing, read the Talmud?
No, I mean, I'll enthusiastically sell any book that I think is worth reading. That's one of many. I feel like I can't. When you were in the store, you were thinking about Maimonides, if I remember correctly.
I have finished at long last a biography of Maimonides for the Yale Jewish Life series. I hope to publish it next year.
Excellent. Well, so for you, as someone who engages with the literary side of the Jewish tradition, how is that? Like, speak a little bit maybe to how you think about those books and how you tie them into whether it's Lewis Carroll or Borges or any of the other literary interests.
All of them, because what I found so fascinating about Maimonides is his trust in reason. And ever we need a trust in reason, it is in our time. And Maimonides believed that you could even reach faith through reason. So yes, he is on the same shelf as Lewis Carroll and Borges and all others who use reason in such a creative way.
That's wonderful. You'll appreciate this. I had a conversation, it was for a podcast with a history professor, and we were talking about how readers, and so part of the book I speak to how we adjacencies and what we do in terms of grouping books together, how people organize their libraries, how bookstores organize their collections. And there are many ways to do it. City Lights is one of the most creative and visionary, actually, in terms of how the collections are brought together. And in fact, McNally Jackson has followed City Lights and Paul, your approach to world literature and thinking about how to group together world literature, for instance. But one of the things he said was that he has a section for his guides for the perplexed. And I said, how many guides for the perplexed are there? He goes, oh, like my fishing guide and my hunting guide and Gems of the World. And I'm like, oh, guides for the perplexed. I got it. I thought it was just the funniest thing to think of it in that way.
Really wonderful. Yes. But it is so interesting to see Paul's question about how a library is organized, how a bookstore is organized, indicates so much about the way in which one thinks. And entering a bookstore, you enter in some sense the bookseller's mind that organizes the bookstore in sections, in continents, in planets, and around what do those planets circle. And I'm completely willing to abandon my labels and categories and go into a universe that's classified in a different way, because the classification is always revealing as a form of censorship, of course, because no bookseller can collect everything, but also as a form of creative association and creating areas of interest. I love that. In the London Library, not a bookstore, they have these quirky sections of specific areas of curiosity that attract the reader because they're so unique. And it was the same in Co-op, but especially in City Lights.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and I have to say that I really drew quite a bit from your work in thinking about classification. And one of the things that you said that I quote in the book that I just absolutely, I think is just gorgeous, is that you point out that, so we're putting classifications on there, as is, Library of Congress and other places. But and this is quoting you, whatever classifications have been chosen, every library tyrannizes the act of reading and forces the reader, the curious reader, the alert reader, to rescue the book from the category to which it has been condemned. I love that. And I think this speaks again to the heterodox, right? This speaks to the singularity of these books. We group together poetry. I mean, even grouping together, Valerie, these are not, every book is different in this series. And in fact, within each series, within each book, because they're done by genre, right? So there's prose poetry and dialogues, and the dialogues are so different, and they're not, but this is how we categorize it. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful thought that you have.
Maybe the best solution is the one Valery himself proposed, which is to consider every work written as the work of an anonymous author with a capital A. And so you read world literature as we read the Bible, a mixture of proverbs and historical works, fairy tales and poetry, and consider it that it has a certain coherence that's given simply by the fact that it's in one bookstore or under one cover.
That's right. I'm going to take this opportunity to acknowledge, and this is someone else who's in the acknowledgements who there are a few people who died while the book was being written, who meant a lot to me. And one of them was Michael Seidenberg, who ran Brazenhead Books in New York, which was a speakeasy. And I don't know if either of you, Paul or Alberto, had an opportunity to see his apartments. There were two of them, and they were absolutely astonishing places. And you have to just knock on the door, and he'd let you into his home. But like City Lights, and now what we're trying to do, booksellers as publishers, Michael started doing publishing. It was a journal, Brazenhead Journal, and he had a like a lottery scratcher, I forget what they're called, on the author's name. And it was Jonathan Lethem would spend a lot of time there. A lot of authors spend time there, and so you would buy these things. I have my copy, and I never scratched it. I don't know who wrote these, but like that seems to me like an interesting way to approach it. Is you confront the book itself and leave it there.
Well, that's Borges's method in Pierre Menard, author of Cote, because he says to attribute to Louis Ferdinand Céline or to James Joyce the Imitation of Christ, what the renovation for these spiritual exercises.
That's exactly right. Can I read really quickly that there's an extract from an excerpt from a Borges poem in the book that I just love so much, and I just want to share it with the audience if that's okay. And it's from something called Poem of the Gifts. 2 seconds here. And so what happens, and Alberto, I don't know, maybe you can tell the story because there's a history, and you're a part of this tradition at the National Library of blind library directors. Can you? And I know this from you. If you can maybe tell the story, and then I'll.
But I
right.
going blind when I was working there. Yes, he was the third blind director of the National Library.
Right.
And when he was appointed in 1955, he was already blind, and he wrote this poem that you're going to quote.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, so it begins, so I'm just going to read the very beginning. It's the first 6 lines, and I think it's true for all of us. I don't think it's just true for Borges. Let no one impute to self-pity or censure the power of the thing I affirm, that God, with magnificent irony, has dealt me the gift of these books and the dark with one stroke. He has lifted these eyes, now made lightless, to be lords of the city of books. And just an acknowledgement that we all, with all of the books that we have, there are only so many books we're going to be able to get to in this lifetime, and that we are also gifted these books and the dark. It's a beautiful, beautiful concept.
And it doesn't matter because books are very patient. And if we won't be able to read them in our lifetime, might be able to read them in the next.
Absolutely. I want to pause for.
I want to ask you, because I love this book so much. So is there another volume after this? Memoirs of a bookseller, recommendations of a bookseller, aspirations of a bookseller?
I am working on some things. I don't know where it will go, but we'll see. I think you've been a great model of follow your enthusiasms and follow your interests and write about them. And I really have loved watching your career and how you've shifted your focus on. And it's it really, I can see your library in what you write. And Valerie writes about this, right? We write what we read, and so I'm excited to think about another book. I don't know
what the area is that you will venture into.
I'm thinking a lot about religion and religious concepts for the secular, things like idolatry. There's something called kavana in Hebrew, which is like intention or presence. And so it's kind of religious concepts for the secular that are really reflecting, again, a browse through the bookstore. And the book, as you know, and again, I think this follows your model. If anything, it's in the Manguellian tradition. And it is, a browse, like the book itself, and just to for those who haven't read it yet or spent time with it, it really is attempting to recreate the browse. So like and if you look, Princeton did a beautiful job with the end papers. It's one of my favorite parts of the book. You're inside the bookstore. And the idea is that it takes you into the bookstore, it takes the reader into the bookstore. And I pull a book off the shelf and read a few lines and put it back and have a few thoughts. And there were reveries and asides and engagements. And
thoughts on browsing, because it's part of the gastronomical vocabulary that we use for reading. Cows browse. But more than that, the idea of browsing as going through erratically in a bookstore, allowing chance to be your guide, is very close to the idea of the flaneur in Paris, stroller. There is no real equivalent, but the idea of an activity that is not driven by intention, that seeks the desire and the intention in what you find. And it is the bookseller that lays out those temptations like golden apples on the shelf. And I love that in your book.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. And what does it mean to browse? Well, once you find the proper browsage, then you ruminate, right? The gastronomical, right? And we digest these things, and that becomes, and then we write our books, and then we start over. And so it's a really, So that is the hope for the future. I will say, I mean, I know we're coming close to the end here, and I think that part of what is, I think this is just so delightful, and it's so amazing to spend time with you, Alberto, and Paul, and anyone who's been able to spend time with either of you knows just how rich your references are and your knowledge and what it means to be among books. And I think that part of what I'm hoping to do with this celebration is bring these sorts of and this is like just joy and delight for all of us, right? And to bring this delight and this joy and this particular form of paradise to the world, and to say there are so many ways one might spend their time, and life is long and short, right? And what can we do to get more people to just share in this incredible endeavor that we are all so inspired by, and gives us so much meaning? That really is the point of the celebration of In Praise of
Let me add to that, since you quoted Borges, another Borges quote. Borges said that he preferred reading to writing, because a writer writes what he can, but a reader reads what he wants, and that happiness cannot be obligatory.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And that's in your book. That's the credo of the browser.
Right. I want to share an amusing aside. Sorry, Peter, if I have, is that okay? Can I one?
Oh,
very briefly,
please take your time. I'm loving this.
This is, you mentioned Annie Dillard, discovering Annie Dillard. I had a wonderful conversation with Wendy Doniger, who, one of our great scholars of South Asian history and religion. And she and Annie Dillard are good friends. And she had told me this anecdote a couple of years ago about writing. And when I was working on the book, I thought I remembered it, and I shared it with her. I said, Wendy, I was thinking about what you told me about Annie Dillard, and this is my first book, and I'm writing, I'm spending all this time, and just like Annie, it's been really frustrating because I have to read my own work all the time, and I just want to read somebody better. And she said, no, you've got it all wrong. That's not how it went. What she said to me was that what you love, Wendy, so much about writing is that you get to read your favorite writer all the time. And she cracked up and thought, okay, well, that I got it completely wrong, and I am much more like Annie and would rather be reading others. Anyway, Peter, go ahead. I apologize. Taking questions? Or?
Well, I'm doing a little Snoopy dance here. I found such resonance with your talk today. I mean, this has been such a delight and such a pleasure. And we've run out of time, but there's more. We have 2 more sessions coming up, so I encourage everybody, please join us. Jeff, ever grateful to you for this book, for being here. Alberto, a great honor, and really want to thank everyone in the audience. I mean, there's so much enthusiasm. As I said, this program isn't over. Our next session is coming up at 12:30 Pacific, 2:30 Central, and I think 3:30 Eastern. It's called The Making of a Good Bookstore: Space, Abundance, and Value. We hope to see you all there. I want to remind you, we've posted links in the chat with which you may purchase copies of In Praise of Good Bookstores, but also much, much more. We've just inaugurated a new website. It has a greater part of our inventory online. We are so happy about this and want to share it with you. So please check out the City Lights website. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events, a publishing program, educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So be well, everyone, and hope to see you in a little bit.
I just want to say thank you. And for everyone that is not currently buying books in bookstores or saying thank you to their booksellers or thinking about these issues, don't worry about it. Just keep reading, and let's just continue to work toward the model that we want, and the enthusiasm that stores bring into their communities are really, that is the thing that we're trying to do, is just build a great life of reading. So I'll leave it with that.
Goodbye and thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you so much, Alberto. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank
See you
you.
in Lisbon.
In Lisbon for sure.
See you in Lisbon.